So, hello everybody. Today we're going to talk about inclusive architecture and how to build it in terms of PAMstack and Angular. PAMstack is a framework for building sustainable development teams. PAMstack stands for Process, Abstractions, or in this case Angular, and Mentorship. We'll explore these three pillars throughout this talk. If you have a good foundation for your team, that means that your team is now enabled. In this talk, we'll discuss how inclusive architectures with Angular enable junior developers. Focus on what these ideas can do for your team as a whole. Less project maintenance, a code base not reliant on a handful of senior developers, less stress, process-enabled conflict resolution, and more team buy-in, cooperative teams, code conventions and standards to help with cooperation, lower cost over time on developers. A more approachable code base means you don't have to spend top dollar on every headcount, and more inclusion, because with a good foundation, you have the ability to hire juniors, which will allow for a more diverse set of candidates. I'm Katerina Skroumpelou. I'm a software engineer at ThisDot. I'm also the Angular Athens Meetup co-founder. I'm a GD for Angular, Web Technologies, and the Google Maps platform, as my MC said. I also run a project called GreeceHopper.js, where I am mentoring remote areas in Greece. I'm also in the program committee of the Vox Days conference in Greece, and also I'm a speaker, an instructor, and a mentor. And as we said, Tracy Lee was supposed to be here with us, but her airline chose otherwise, unfortunately. So Tracy is the lead at ThisDot Labs. She's my boss, and she's awesome. So at ThisDot, we do JavaScript consulting and Angular consulting more specifically, and we're also hiring. So let's talk about why juniors are not successful in your team. A lot of time, it's not the fault of the juniors and their so-called lack of knowledge. People perceive that the reason the juniors don't succeed in their teams is due to the fault of the juniors, but it may be the fault of the teams. Not making inclusive decisions in your code base, decisions about how to structure your team, may be the reason for early failures where juniors are starting up. But these decisions actually affect everybody, not just the juniors. Here are some great examples of why juniors fail on their teams. There might be poor onboarding documentation. Juniors always have to ask questions about everything, and there's no reference that they can look up on their own. Also, some teams rely on individual excellence. Seniors have to micromanage juniors to make sure they don't make mistakes. But if juniors don't make mistakes, then the mistakes they make, actually, if the mistakes the juniors make, might affect directly users negatively. Basically, if you rely on individual excellence, then you can't really afford to hire juniors because they need to be babysat. Also, you might have an unnecessary complex code base. Why overcomplicate development and design problems that do not need to be complex? Are you using abstractions that could help juniors and the rest of your team be more successful and productive? When you have teams where everyone assumes that everybody is on their own and they should do learning themselves, teams and individuals become stagnant. Here is how it hurts everyone. Poor onboarding docs means that it's hard to onboard and hire new people. You spend more time explaining the same thing to every new person, and knowledge is inconsistent. Every person needs to be a senior and have the ability to jump in to learn how to swim. Also, individual excellence runs teams. You get the hit by a bus fears, which means that people silo their experience and soon are the only person that knows a certain system. If you lose them, if they're hit by a bus, you could lose months or years of effort to try to reverse engineer their work. Also, complex code bases make teams unproductive. When your code base deviates from industry standards or things are more hand-rolled, it's much more difficult for anyone to get productive immediately. On the other hand, relying on standards and best practices can help someone be productive from day one. Also, lack of advancement. Without mentorship, you're not creating your next senior developers or architects, meaning you end up hiring to fill higher-level vacancies instead of promoting people from within. So what could your project be with an inclusive vision? Individuals succeed and are enabled by teamwork and collaboration. There are processes in place and mentorship in place to create a great supportive culture. Also, you decrease unnecessary complexity and focus on important features. You simplify your life by using abstractions, tools, and frameworks. Also, you have more innovation, more excitement, and more learning, which leads to less stress, more teaching across skill levels, more inspiration and collaboration. And a wider and more diverse set of engineers and skills for your team. There is the ability to bring on juniors and mids with a more approachable environment and code base. Now let's get back to the PAMstack. These ideas are supposed to help you build an inclusive team. Let's focus on process first. Many of you may hear a word like process and immediately zone out. Processes don't have to be lots of paperwork, endless meetings, fussy buzzwords. There's a better way. I'll lead you through a description of an organization with no process. If this sounds like your team, then you know you're missing something. Processes are usually ad hoc and chaotic. The organization usually does not provide a stable environment to support processes. Success in these organizations depends on the competence and heroics of the people in the organization and not on the use of proven processes. These organizations are characterized by a tendency to overcommit, abandon their processes in time of crisis, and be unable to repeat their successes. A lack of process means only the so-called rockstar developers can succeed on the project. Also, constant overcommitment and rushed things. Does this sound familiar? Why did a project fail or succeed? It's completely arbitrary. Projects always go over schedule and blow through their budget. No one knows who is supposed to do what, there is confusion over roles and responsibilities, micromanagement, and backshedding. The codes I just read are from the Capability Maturity Model Integration for Development, which is a process framework that you can look up later. It's CMMI. If process is done conscientiously and deliberately, process can mean clear expectations, greater team engagement and cooperation, no single points of failure, less stress during the crazy times, and the reduce of conflicts and power struggles. Let's talk about some super easy things you can do to integrate good process in your teams. An easy way to start being successful with process is doing things like creating plans. Creating plans allows you to ask things like what needs to be done, who will do those things, how should it be done, and when should it be done. Write things down and follow them. Here is a plan for a code review. This is an example of how to help a better process for all. First of all, write the purpose down. For example, the purpose of code review is to ensure that changes to source code verification items are correct, appropriate, and follow societal guidelines. It's also to discover and correct defects in code before they can be observed by testers or customers. Then walk through the process that needs to be met each time. For example, a first step would be once all peer reviewers have completed the review, the author responds to comments and corrects defects. This also discusses disagreements, so that when there is a conflict within the team, there is a predetermined way to deal with that disagreement instead of relying on office politics to get the answer. For example, if there's a disagreement about how to resolve an issue, the parties involved should work together to reach compromise. If an agreement is not reached, the development manager will arbitrate the dispute. If a review defect cannot be resolved in the scope of a peer review, it will be marked as struck externally, and a defect will be created in the quality standard for the issue, and the defect number is added on the peer review for traceability. Defining roles and responsibilities is often overlooked as an integral part of making a team functional. Here, we list the people who participate in this particular process. We also list the responsibilities of each role with respect to this process. This way, everyone knows what part they're supposed to play on the team or within the process. In the previous example of the code review, we might have the author, the person who makes the initial changes to the code, makes the review in code collaborator, and revises the verification items based on the results of the peer review. Then you have the peer reviewers, responsible for reviewing verification items, and this can be any developer except the author. At least one peer reviewer is required, of course. Then you have the observers, responsible for reviewing the code, and can be any project for team member. Unlike peer reviewers, they are not required to approve a review before it concludes. Having an observer is not required either. And you have the developers who take all the above roles. Another easy way to add process into your teams is by creating checklists. These reduce the error-prone ways of humans. Checklists will also help junior developers and new team members know what to do. And as humans, we get busy and stressed out. Sometimes we forget things, we make mistakes. Checklists reduce that cognitive load. Also, make sure you're reviewing what you're doing on the team often. One mistake most teams make is that they only review code. You can also and should review anything that might affect the customer, product, or users. For example, meeting notes. Make sure you don't miss anything or have disagreements about what was said. The designs, the requirements. Make sure they are the right requirements and everybody's on the same page. Tests. Are you testing the right things? And plans. Do you agree on the plan? And also emails and communication with clients and documentation. Make sure you have the right tone and you're not over-promising. Now let's talk about the next pillar, abstractions, specifically with Angular. What we'll review next help us make building of software more accessible. These tools, abstractions, and approaches will also enable your team to achieve greater happiness, productivity, and inclusivity. The first thing we should acknowledge is that web development is hard. There's a lot to know. You have performance, security, accessibility, responsive design, progressive enhancement, browser compatibility, progressive web apps. Every year, there is more stuff we need to learn. It's very difficult to get to a level of success these days. And this leads to JavaScript fatigue as well. But guess what? Frameworks help. Black boxing is good sometimes. It might be faster to do raw DOM manipulation, but the only people that can do this are the seniors, and you're leaving juniors behind. Let me tell you a little story about how frameworks helped me as a beginner. I was in university, and I had a course project where I had to build a simple responsive website that had to talk to an API. Up until then, I had never built a dynamic website, didn't know anything about routes, API calls, responsive web. After a little bit of Googling to see what people use these days, I ran into AngularJS, it was a long time ago, and Ionic. Oh, I was so happy. There was a framework that could take care of responsiveness, the routes, the application state, DOM manipulation, controllers, views, it had everything. I had a full working app in a couple of days with zero background on all this complex context. Okay, I was a developer, but I wasn't a web developer before. The point is, some frameworks out there, and since we're at NGDE, we'll talk about Angular, provide teams with out-of-the-box tools and toolkits that will help even beginners get started with complex contexts right away. So, okay, Angular is opinionated, but is this a bad thing when it comes to organizing a large team that has to collaborate? I have a friend who's a senior developer at a quite large company in Greece with an equally large developer dynamic. I asked him one day, how do the new team members cope with the huge code base, especially the junior ones? Imagine being a junior in a very large team of mid and senior developers and having to start working on a very large company-wide project with innumerable lines of code, legacy code too, which most of your colleagues have already been working on for months, if not years. That's a terrifying thought, right? Well, that friend told me that they use Angular. What they also told me is that they write their own schematics and component libraries. The very fact that Angular imposes its own strict way of doing things, it makes it easier for a beginner to jump on the train. They read the docs and they understand why things are such. Sorry. The fact that it uses TypeScript makes it easier to avoid bugs, and the code is easier to read. The fact that you have a component-based architecture and you can create libraries and schematics helps beginners start working on smaller projects, on smaller parts of the projects right away, whose purpose is very specifically defined. In that way, a beginner is not lost in a sea of services and dependencies, but can jump right away and start writing code that will affect the whole project. But let's see in detail some facts about Angular and how they can help a junior get started with their own projects and also onboard quicker on larger projects. Angular has a set of tools that can help. It has the Angular, which all of these we're going to see one by one later. It has the Angular CLI, which we'll see, the Angular console, and also external tools like NX, Prettier. It also has great docs. Even the architecture and the code base can help in that way. Angular has a component-based architecture, which allows a lot of code reusability. You have libraries like Rx or NGRX that help, and also TypeScript, which saves you from yourself, and Angular Material, for example, which allows you to make beautiful sites, and also the community, right? Even if you know that a framework is easy, then you also need to know how to set something up. An easy way for you to make it easy for your developers is by using a CLI to create a standard at consistency within your projects. You can find documentation about the CLI and solve problems with a specific tool. Before this, every team set up their own technology stack and configuration from scratch on each project. At best, and some of you might remember that, a company might have a common reference project that teams cloned to start a new project, right? These reference projects could fall out of date, they could be incomplete, or it could be difficult to find help for your particular tech stack. CLI tools are an excellent way to avoid the pitfalls that can occur when scaffolding a project from scratch. They can provide a zero configuration environment of small defaults that work for generalized applications people are building. Out-of-the-box performance using automatic differential serving, lazy loading, tree shaking, even ahead-of-time compilation, and all of the major frameworks already have them. And Angular does, of course, too. All of these tools are actively maintained and regularly kept up to date with core libraries. And these tools help you migrate between versions of libraries too. And the general advice is to avoid rolling your own solutions. There is a large amount of documentation explaining how to build solutions of all types using these CLI tools, usually better than teaching a team about a proprietary tech stack. It's also low risk because ejecting is always a possibility if you have unique needs that are now served by the CLI tool. And there is also a graphical user interface for the Angular CLI if your junior developers are not that familiar with the command line interface, which is the Angular console. But let's also talk here about how the very architecture of Angular apps can help that. Minko Gechev, in his blog post, Scalable Single-Page Application Architecture, describes how to break up an application into layers. The presentation layer is concerned with how the user interface will be drawn and user interaction will be handled. The data management layer is concerned with the state and data that drives the application and how users' actions change the state. Then you have the services layer, which is concerned with how the application communicates externally with the help of other servers or with direct connections to users. And finally, you have the facade layer, which is a layer of abstraction for the data management and services layer for using the presentation layer. We can provide data and a set of basic operations that are necessary for the creation of user interface. The facade model object can translate calls to those operations into all the necessary actions and call to asynchronous services required. So you can have your senior developers to implement the most critical sections and provide hooks for juniors to wire the interface together. That way, the juniors will start working on your application right away, getting familiar with the code as they move along. Then we have components. Talking about architecture, another good thing is that you can build your own components and even component libraries for your Angular projects. You can create components that are reused across projects and applications. Another good thing that Angular offers is that you create dumb presentation components, components that don't have any logic of their own. And this is a good place for a junior to start, I would say. It's the facade layer we talked about. Also, with components, you get easier app-wide style manipulation. It's easier to have consistent styles across an application and a better way to manage CSS. For example, by wrapping your inputs and buttons into your custom components. This also allows for you to create small tags for onboarding new team members. This helps new team members understand the scale of what they're working on and see their contributions reflect across a whole application. Also, you have TypeScript. The great part of TypeScript is, of course, that it's strongly typed. With JavaScript, you can get carried away and end up with confusing bits of code. And I think most of us are familiar with that. With TypeScript, you're forced to have strongly typed methods, variables, and services. This makes it easier to understand the functionality and purpose of each part of the code. Because it has stricter rules, that means it comes with less bugs, and less need to try and infer which part of the as does what. Instead of trying to figure out what the method will return and how to treat each new thing, you know what to expect and plan accordingly because TypeScript tells you. This leads to better error handling and spotting the root of the problem. Also, in your console, you have more descriptive errors to figure out what is wrong. This helps juniors a lot because a junior learning with a strongly typed language will make them more careful when designing new things, and it will also teach them best practices. And finally, we also have Angular material. The best thing is that you get ready-made UI components, but you also get animations and complex functionalities with out-of-the-box functionalities with these components. You get standard UI components such as menus, headers, tips, and all the other things, but also Angular material provides defaults for more complex things, like the state of a dialog or a model, for example. Code samples in documentation, which can also help you play around with things, are also available in the Angular material documentation, and you can actually copy whole bits of code and adjust them to your needs. And you also get easy global theming, so that you can customize your components to your needs. Then you have other tools that are not Angular-specific, but do help when developing with Angular. You have Prettier, which is a Visual Studio Code plugin, and it makes it easier to impose a project-wide style. This helps teams not bike shed on what the project-wide standard is. Instead of having them understand the style guidelines, you have them use Prettier to figure out how to structure their code better. And it also helps people adopt and get used to best practices. Another cool tool is Annex, which is a set of dev tools for monorepo development. You share code and libraries between front-end and back-end. You reduce code and complexity. And the cool thing is that you can share the same components across different projects. And it gives a new team member a good image of how the application is structured and understand the sharing of the code between the front-end and the back-end. A thing that is Angular-specific is the Angular docs, which are very extensive. They're complete with code samples, and they also have an exhaustive tutorial that teaches you core concepts quickly. So if you run through the tutorial yourself, you will understand how things work very easily, and building a very small application right away. Lastly, we could say about Angular that Angular loves everybody. You have the Angular community, which is a large supportive community with online and physical presence that will help you evolve and will support you throughout your process of learning Angular. And Angular, the ecosystem that goes with it, create a setting that welcomes juniors, and it offers various ways to get started while also welcoming new team members, not necessarily juniors, helping them start working on an existing code base right away. So we've talked about two pillars so far, process and abstractions with Angular. Let's talk about mentorship. One of the reasons this pillar is so important is because it's a culture shift from within your organization. When we're thinking about what a proper culture of mentorship could look like, let's think of a team with the following requirement. No employee can be promoted unless you can nominate someone to be promoted into the role. Suddenly, it's not beneficial to selfishly pursue one's own promotions and ambitions. Suddenly, the rockstar development becomes the rockstar mentor. Hiring is expensive. It's better to keep your people. Costs for hiring someone include a lot of time spent for technical personnel to conduct interviews, team members to onboard, the train a new member, and also if you lose someone critical, other developers need to pick up the slack while you recruit and train a new developer. The hiring can take up to 6 to 8 weeks, and the ramp-up could take up to 6 months or longer. This can cause burnout and unhappiness for your remaining workers. The best plan is to make it so that no one ever wants to leave. Mentorship has several significant and positive effects that have been shown over time and time again. Benefits include the acceleration of learning and growth, the increase of confidence, the decreased fear of contribution, collaboration, and idea sharing, the increased communication skills of your people, mentees feel more invested in and valued, and it also improves upward mobility. A Sun Microsystems study found that mentees are 5 times more likely to be promoted, and mentees become mentors and pass the benefits on. Benefits for the company include great perk for recruiting, the increased developer productivity and retention. Mentors and mentees are 70% more likely to stay compared to other employees. They also reduce knowledge silos. They improve the buzz factor. As we said, it reduces succession risks. They create a more positive, helpful, and collaborative team culture, and they increase loyalty to your company. They also increase employee engagement and motivation, dramatically improving financial outcomes. And it improves leader identification and the promotion pipeline. Mentors are 6 times more likely to be promoted. So you might be saying, OK, we get it, we agree, mentorship is good, but how do I add this to my team? What does it look like? Well, a general hunger to learn and share that learning with others is indicative of a mentorship culture. Great mentorship activities include formal one-on-one sessions. It's the first thing people think when they think of mentorship, right? A senior and a junior on Meet go into a room and talk about development tactics. Also, code reviews. Authors learn from the comments of the reviewers. Reviewers learn new patterns and important information about the system from the author's code. Pair programming. Pair 2 juniors with seniors. Let the seniors dictate and the juniors drive. The two can ask each other questions and implement code together. And I can tell you this was one of the most important things when I started my career, the pair programming with a senior. Also, tech talks. Tech talks are where developers prepare a conference talk-like presentation and deliver it to their peers. Their peers learn new information from the talk themselves, and this can also help improve communication skills and introduce people to potential joys of public speaking. And also chat channels. Promote and create chat channels where your developers can share ideas and practices. So we talked about a lot of things today, but they can all be summarized into the PAMstack: process, abstractions with Angular, and mentorship. Boost your process by writing things down, sharing with the team. Mentor and help your peers who are being onboarded. Ask questions about the project, code, or process. Document the answers and share with others. Do not ask for code reviews proactively as a way to understand, get feedback, and create a culture for mentorship. If a team loves your process or ideas, ask for it to be formally incorporated into the process. That was it for today, the PAMstack. One last thing. At this dot, we have 3 upcoming events. We have the Angular Online on September 5th. We have Angular Girls Online on September 28th. And we have a Cloud Functions and Firebase training on October 8th. And if you're interested in Angular consulting, let us know, we're hiring. And thank you very much. And I hope you incorporate the PAMstack into your teams.